Good evening. My name is Paula DeWitowitz. I'm the research coordinator for the PhD education program for the School of Education and Professional Licensure. And tonight I'm going to cover a Chapter 1 overview. Basically, I'm going to hit the high points, the things that are often confusing to students, things that could be a few tips you could use to try to help you stay on track, where you're going to get the information that goes into each section, that kind of thing, so that you can get your best start with Chapter 1 as good a start with Chapter 1 as you can. Before starting, there are a couple of things I want to mention just to make sure you have them on your radar. Walden provides a template for students to use to develop their dissertations. I recommend that you use that from the beginning. The reason is that when you try to copy and drop material into that template, you can on occasion break it. So all of the macros that are put in will be erased. So if you start with the template, then it is easier to keep those macros in place. The margins will stay right. The formatting for headers and the table of contents will stay clear, so that's just something to keep in mind. You can find that template on the Writing Center webpage. The other thing is that you need to make sure you keep your abstract pages in front. So there's a cover page for your abstract and the page on which you'll put the abstract itself. Please keep those two pages in place as you're developing your proposal and then later your dissertation. When you develop your proposal specifically, I suggest you have two copies. One is the copy that you turn in for your proposal, and the other is a copy that retains all of the Chapter 4 and 5 material there. So the shells for those chapters continue to exist. On the one that you pass in or you put into task stream for review, you can delete those Chapter 4 and 5 sections just for the purposes of proposal development, keeping the other copy that is accurate and ready to drop Chapters 4 and 5 in. Of course, then if you make changes to that version that you have in task stream based on committee review or URR review as a part of that committee process, you're going to want to go back and make those similar changes in the version that you have with Chapters 4 and 5 intact. So if that's useful to you, then go ahead. Just make sure that you double back and keep that extra material there and up to date in case you make any changes after you've deleted your Chapter 3 and 4 and you put the material into the template or into task stream for review. I want to go section by section. So your first section will be your introduction. It can be brief or a little bit longer. Usually 1 to 3 pages is about the max. It's really about your social problem, the background for that social problem. Some information will be research that you've developed from your Chapter 2 perhaps, but some of it will also be information from newspapers, statistics from the government or government statute information, anything like that that would not be appropriate for Chapter 2, but is dealing specifically with your social problem can go into that introduction. That is the only place in your whole dissertation where that material should be. That is to help set the stage for the social problem. Now, if you don't need it, then it's appropriate not to have it there. But this is where it might be appropriate for you to use it. Okay, and there can also be, and often will / should be, some scholarly information there as well. Your background is where you really begin to discuss the peer-reviewed literature. Now, all of the background is probably going to come from your Chapter 2 development. The reason I say that is because you're not going to have anything but peer-reviewed literature in here. This is our background on what is known in the scholarly literature on your topic. Okay? Think of it as a short summary. Your lit review is going to be in Chapter 2, a number of pages. Think of your background section as 1 to 3 pages, really giving us a high-level overview of what is known about your topic and leading us logically to the gap that you've identified, what it is you need to research. So that's what this process is really for in the background, to take us from, as a bridge from what is known as the social problem through what is generally known / specifically known about what you've identified as your research gap. Okay, and at the end of that section, we should have a clear picture of what you have determined is not known in the literature and what you plan on addressing in your study. Your problem statement is only going to be a few paragraphs. It's not meant to be something long, it's meant to be something brief. Often, faculty will want you to include a paragraph that summarizes the social problem. Now, you won't find this on your checklist, but your committees often like that because it gives you a chance to present your social problem and your research problem in close proximity so that the alignment and the clarity of focus of where you're going can be obvious in this section. So if you do that, have a paragraph talking about your social problem, make sure your committee is clear on it and that that's what they want to see. Otherwise, you're going to focus a paragraph or two on your research problem itself. You're going to describe for us what the gap in the literature you found is. You're not going to go into a lot of detail. You're going to try to be very succinct here. Only use a few sentences if you can. Keep in mind that you're going to present this this research problem in multiple places within your dissertation. So each time that you present it, if you use the same wording, you will be sure that you don't inadvertently introduce another part to your research gap, something else you're going to consider or something else that you should consider, which can happen if you're not careful. Simply by rewording and trying to find a different way to say what your gap is, what your research problem is, you can create new problems for yourself. So repetition is not a bad thing here. You may have a research gap that is large. It may be something that's really not researched very much. And you may need to narrow that research problem here. Okay, so you can state what the large gap is, and then you can say, however, the problem that's going to be examined here is only this piece of it. That is fair. It could be a small gap, okay? And what we want to make sure then is that your purpose aligns directly with it. Taking on too large a problem can prevent you from ever completing, because it may not be possible for you to really do an effective dissertation that will cover all of the gaps. So do not be afraid of narrowing your gap to make it something workable for the purposes of this study. Your purpose is going to directly align with whatever your problem is. It's going to state the specific piece of the research problem you're going to address, if it is a large problem. It's going to indicate what the phenomenon you're going to look at is, and the setting, okay? Not a lot about the setting, but something very succinct and brief. You're going to state the kind of population you're looking at, the kind of setting that you're going to be looking at it in. You're not going to mention the specific location. So for example, if you're in Tampa, you're not going to mention Tampa, okay? You're not going to mention any specific location, because remember that your research gap, your problem, is not a specific location, but is instead a gap in the literature, and your purpose is to fill that gap in the literature. Now, you will do your study in a specific location, but you will not be trying to address the problem only in that location. You're going to be looking at the problem as a whole, and that's going to be the specific location in which you actually try to accomplish your goal. So you don't want to list your purpose here as looking at a specific location like Tampa, New Orleans, something like that, okay? That's not the purpose of that, of your study. Okay, so be careful about that. Again, you're going to mention the type of study here. So if whatever kind of study it actually is, again, it's just a sentence, a brief mentioning of what kind of study design you've got. Your research questions will come next. If you're doing a qualitative study, they're going to be open-ended questions: who, what, when, where, how, or why. If you're doing a case study using a yin format, a yin design, okay, you may have propositions, which are statements based on the research literature you've read for Chapter 2 of what you suspect you will find. They are not true hypotheses, because you're not going to try to prove them true or not. You're going to state that these are things that you may find based on the previous literature. On the other hand, if you're doing a quantitative study, you're going to have questions that can be answered with yes or no, potentially. Is there a statistically significant difference? Is there a statistically significant correlation? Something like that that can be answered with a yes or no. If you have an overarching kind of question, what is the relationship between, then you're going to have hypotheses that say there is a statistically significant correlation or there is not. The first one being the alternate, the second one being the null. either way, whatever kind of question you have, if you're doing a quantitative study, you will have research questions and hypotheses. And those are what should be presented here. Again, qualitative, you could have questions. If it's a case study using a yin format, you could have propositions to go with those. Quantitative, you're going to have your research questions and you're going to have hypotheses, alternate and null, that can be tested. Your framework is going to evolve from your Chapter 2 development. If it's a theoretical framework, basically for a quantitative study, it's going to be something that you are testing. It could be a theory. It could be hypotheses formed by someone at the end of their own study. It could be something that you develop as a hypothesis based on research that had been conducted and the conclusions from that research that you want to test. But it's going to be something that tells us exactly what it is you're going to be testing. Okay, so that's going to be the basis of your theoretical framework. And again, that will be something that you identify as you conduct your literature review so that you can identify the approach you're going to take for your study itself. If it's a qualitative or a mixed method study, you're going to use a conceptual framework, which is going to be based on current research or current and old research, but it's going to be something that gives us a perspective. So often it's 2 or 3 pieces that you put together to give us a lens, an approach that you're going to use. It could include a theory, but it doesn't have to. And it's not something that's being tested. It's a way you're going to look at your study. Okay, it's a way you're going to look at the research that you examine, the data that you collect, that helps us to understand why you're choosing that approach. Often, again, that will come from Chapter 2, from the articles that you've read most commonly about your topic most often, something that strikes you as useful in relation to your own study and gives a basis for our understanding why you're approaching it the way you are. So the logical link between all of the parts of the framework should be clearly presented. There should be no questions of what you're trying to do, and it should be clearly presented how the background flows into the problem flows into the purpose flows into the questions, and the framework supports the questions based on all of the information before. All of these previous portions will come from review of some literature. Now, most of this will come from your Chapter 2 literature, okay? Your background, problem, purpose, and your framework. The consumer literature and professional literature can be in your introduction. Some professional literature may be in your background, but most often that will not apply. Remember that your background is really a summary of your Chapter 2 information. The introduction is really the only place where you're going to have anything that is consumer-based literature, because you're talking about your social problem there. The nature of the study is going to be where you start to bring in Chapter 3. The methodology that's used is going to be named there. You're going to name the phenomenon that you're identifying and that you're going to study. And if it's a case study in particular, you're going to name the case very specifically. You're going to give us a few details about the methodology without identifying the location where you're going to do your study. So you're going to talk about the kind of population, the kind of setting, the data sources that you're going to use. That's to give us an overview of what you're thinking of doing. Remember, Chapter 1 is really an overview of what you plan to do in your study. It's a place where we can look to see how all your pieces align, why they align, and whether or not the study is going to be viable. So this is really a summary of what you're thinking. Not a lot of detail here, enough for us to see what you have in mind, enough to be specific, but not the nitty-gritty details that you'll put into Chapter 3. Again, nature of the study comes from Chapter 3. Your definitions are going to come mostly from Chapter 2. Okay, they're going to be from peer-reviewed literature. Only those that are unique to your study need to be defined, okay? Or that are unusual, things that you don't expect people to really understand. So for example, you might not need to define an email, but you might need to define a voice thread, perhaps, if that's something you're going to work with and you don't think everyone understands it, okay? Your citations should always be included. If there is a definition that is generally used and then is going to be applied in some specific way to your study, then you need to include the general definition and then tell us how you're going to tailor it specifically for your study. So for example, let's say that you were going to include email because of the way that it's going to be used in this. So let's say that you're going to define email and give a citation for it and say, in this particular study, email is going to be examined in relation to a specific kind of formatting for emails that is blah, 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 blah. Okay, so you can do that, and you can use a more general definition and then tell us how it works specifically afterward. Something else to remember is that you are not going to use things like Wikipedia or a dictionary, any kind of encyclopedia. Those are not going to be used. You should not be using articles from newspapers, any of those kinds of sources. So think peer-reviewed, think sometimes government sources, because some definitions come from government statutes, those kinds of things, especially for early childhood or special education. But think in terms of something professional / peer-reviewed for your definitions. Definitions will come from chapter 2 most of the time. Your assumptions are really a place where students get hung up, and I've got 3 slides here that cover assumptions. So I'm going to leave them up as I talk through, but I'm going to point out only a few different things. I've got them here for you to look back at if you want to kind of scope them out later and get a little more detail. Excuse me. But one of the things I want you to understand is that assumptions are really very specific, okay? We all come into the world with assumptions. We come into our studies with assumptions, but that's not what this means. We have assumptions in life, we have that definition, and we have specific assumptions in research. And research assumptions are a very narrow band of things we can assume. So for example, we might have honesty, accuracy of information provided, or the usefulness of something in terms of what is presented versus what you actually get. So let me explain what that means. Essentially, an assumption is something about your study that must be true, that you have no control over, okay? But it must be true in order for the study to be accurate, to be valid, okay? So let's talk about what that might look like. All right, so here we talk a little bit about common assumptions. Okay, so assumptions are critical to the meaningfulness of the study. And in this particular case, believing that the participants are being truthful is important, okay? This is going to be the biggest one that we often see, the idea that participants are being truthful, because we can't verify it. We're not going to give them a lie detector test. We're not going to do a background check. So we have to assume that they're being honest in order for anything they provide us to be valid. Okay, so what else? We can assume that if someone tells us that they know about the phenomenon we're looking at, that they're being truthful and that they would be valid sources. We can assume that they will be honest about what they tell us. We can assume that the instrument will give us reliable responses. Now, keep in mind that the instrument giving us reliable responses really means that people are responding reliably to or honestly to what's going on, okay? That the respondents will understand the questions that they're being asked. We can screen them to make sure that they have the knowledge level that they need. We can ask them that. We can make sure that we find out whether they can read at a certain grade level, that kind of thing. We can screen for those kinds of things. But once we do that, then we have to trust them to understand the questions, that they'll provide honest answers. This last one is important too, because essentially when it says here the researcher will present the 4-day in-class arid lands curriculum in a consistent manner, we need to make sure that we've trained them, or that we know that they've gotten the training to be able to do that. And then that they've made the commitment to do that for us. Once they do that, then we have to trust them to be honest. So it really, a lot of it comes back down to honesty of the respondents or the participants, and to us having done our research so that we can say, with a measure of certainty that this is actually what is going to happen, that we can trust people to do this. So assumptions are aspects of the study design that must be true for the study to be true, but things over which you have no control. So you can't guarantee people will be honest. You can't guarantee that they will represent themselves accurately. You can't guarantee that they will take the time to give you detailed responses, but you can trust them, and you have to trust them if they say that they will do these things, okay? And those are what assumptions are. Scope and delimitations are two sides of the same coin, what the researcher chooses to cover and what the researcher chooses not to cover. So scope is the idea of what you will cover. This study will examine X, Y, or Z. Delimitation is what you choose not to cover. Now it mentions here the idea of generalizations, okay? What you're not going to be able to generalize to. Remember, if you're doing qualitative research, we don't talk about generalizations, it's transferability. But if you set up a delimitation there, then you are actively choosing not to cover something, okay? So it will either be something that you guarantee will not be generalizable to whatever, or that may not be transferable, okay? Delimitations are a valid way of controlling the size of your study or the size of your, the gap that you address, the research gap that you address. So keep in mind that these are controllable items on your part though, okay? Limitations are different. They're things that are inherent to the design of the study, the method that you're using for the study that you're conducting. So for example, any kind of qualitative study has the delimitation of not being generalizable. It is only transferable if the population, the situation, the participants are all similar, okay? So you have an immediate delimitation, or a limitation, excuse me, based on that design. A correlational study has a limitation in that it is not causally related. You cannot draw causality from a correlational study. So those are limitations. Every study design has limitations imposed on it. Phenomenologies, you can only draw conclusions about people's experiences. You cannot draw conclusions about why they believe what they believe, how they came to believe what they believe. Those kinds of things are not part of a phenomenology. So everything has limitations based on the design of our methodology that's being used. Assumptions, scope, delimitations, and limitations all come from Chapter 3. Significance is something that you have to be careful not to overassume or overstate. Basically, significance talks about the potential contributions that you can glean from your study. And remember that they have to be potentially. This can do this could do this might do this. Okay, it is hoped this will do this. The idea is that you talk about how they can advance knowledge, advance practice, or knowledge about practice, okay, which is more accurate, because remember that you're trying to advance the body of knowledge, and positive social change potential. Don't overstate. You don't have to fix the world with your dissertation. And overstating can give people who read your work the idea that you don't understand just that, how much your study can and cannot do. So be realistic. You don't have to change everything. You can help administrators understand how they can help teachers. You can help teachers understand how they can help students. You can help parents understand how they can help students. You can help administrators understand how to help teachers and parents talk better. You don't have to make huge sweeping changes. This doesn't have to apply to everyone. It doesn't have to fix the problem, but it has to be realistic. So significance, please be careful not to overstate, but do include there what you think your study can help with, okay? You're going to collect your significance, or draw your significance really, from Chapter 2, and you're going to think about what you're doing in Chapter 3, and those two pieces together will help you to identify just what your significance can be. Your summary is going to be just a few paragraphs. You'll have a paragraph maybe that talks about your problem, or your problem and purpose. You'll have a paragraph that talks about your purpose, perhaps separately. You'll talk about your design and significance, and then you'll talk about your following chapters. There are only going to be a couple of sentences. Chapter 2 will cover this, Chapter 3 will cover that, and that's your summary for Chapter 1. So this is how you set up your Chapter 1. This is how the pieces flow, and what they show us is first your social problem, then your research problem, then how you've built your understanding of that research problem, then your research problem, then your purpose, your questions, how all those pieces align with each other, then how your framework fits in, and your definitions, explaining how you're going to put all of these pieces together, how you're going to define the things that are important to understand so that we can see what you're doing, and going down from there, talking about the things that are going to limit or strengthen your study design. So everything falls together and we get a good summary of what you're doing, and we can see here in one succinct chapter how everything aligns and that you've got a good picture. So that's my conclusion about Chapter 1. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for coming.